What's up guys, Mr. here back in the video. Today's video is part 2 of what if Aljandro and Sierra was in Revenge of the Island, but they were on the with Sierra on the maggots and Aljandro on the rats. So episode 1, Aljandro busts out the robot suit. And they come up with a similar strategy, but I think instead of the rats losing due to the bad luck, Aljandro would actually prevent their bad luck. And he would crash into the maggots. I said in the other Part 1, Aljandro busts out the robot suit and wins it for his team. So I think it makes more sense to believe that this is the case for the rats. Now, for the maggots, they're going to elimination. So this is a bit tough at this point in the season because nobody really is aligned with anyone except for Joe and Zoe and Mike, maybe. And Maria has not done anything that bad yet, or Sierra. Brick Cameron. Zoe and Mike would want to get rid of someone who's not very good at challenges, so they would get rid of Cameron, as they're not close to him at this point. Sierra is friends with Cameron, so she would get Cameron on board to vote for Joe. And Anne Maria would probably vote for Joe, but the other four are voting for Cameron. So I think Cameron would actually be the first boot of the season. Now, you can feel annoyed saying it would be with Joe, but keep in mind that at this point in the season, no one's really known each other. It's not a situation where they don't like Cameron, it's just that they have to put someone off, so it might as well be Cameron. So Cameron's out. Episode 2 is Truth of Laser Shark. Brick would still admit about peeing his pants. And that's that. Stacy would be annoying her entire team. So then we have to do the opposite course. So Scott would still be throwing for about 15 seconds. So basically, I'm going to say two people. Some people have to go in pairs. So I'm going to say it's B and Dawn, Sam and Dakota, Aljandro and Lightning, that leaves Stacy and Scott. Now, starting off with Scott still throws for about 15 seconds, and it comes down to just Sierra and Aljandro. But I think that Sierra would, normally I say Aljandro, but because Scott threw for about 15 seconds, I do think Sierra would be able to win, just because of the fact Aljandro would have to wait for Lightning as well. We'll have to wait for Stacy as well. And I imagine Scott would be throwing to try and make his own team fail, so I think the maggots could actually win this challenge. Scott wants to get rid of Aljandro at this point, but realizes that he has no real reason yet. Aljandro's a threat, but he hasn't got the numbers to get rid of him. So, Dakota, although Dakota will be going home, I think everyone chooses to get rid of Stacy, as Stacy's the most annoying on her team, and he has Lightning and Sam's vote, and Aljandro wants to get Dawn on his side. While B and Dawn are suspicious of Aljandro and Scott, I do think Dawn would be more lenient to Aljandro, as he was a trap soul in the robot suit. Also because of the fact Aljandro, how he acted last season, I think Dawn would be a little more cautious of him. So I do think Stacy gets voted off here. Episode 3, this is the episode where Scott basically sabotages B and Frey instead of sabotaging. I'm going to explain why I don't think he's going to aim for anyone else. Lightning and Sam and Dakota would be easy for Scott to manipulate. I think Aljandro's too smart for Scott to trick him, and he doesn't do it to Dawn originally, so I'm not going to change that. So Aljandro, Scott Frame sabotages B, do the mirror strategy. Sierra would replace Cameron, so they would have a better time guarding the situation. And normally in this episode, Joe works on Anne Maria because she's the weakest link. So I think Joe would still work on Anne Maria, as she would see Sierra useful to keep around. Mike and Zoe, obviously, they're still Mike and Zoe. They still have their interactions. And that's that. So again, Scott sabotages B and gets everyone to vote him off. Dawn was the only person who I think would vote with B is Aljandro, as I think Aljandro would be very suspicious of Scott at this point, as he would know there's no way they all lost challenges so easily with two characters who were heavy hitters, himself and Lightning, very good at physical challenges, lose so easily. So I think Aljandro convinced Dakota and Lightning and Sam. So I think Scott definitely was able to convince Dawn with nature, how B didn't like nature, and that made her flip. I think Aljandro will try to convince Dawn, but because of last season, I don't imagine Dawn would be the type of person who would believe Aljandro for how he was in World Tour. and because this is right after World Tour, Aljandro can't use his charm to probably convince Dawn. It might work on Dawn, but I think Dawn's sticking to the plan and getting rid of B here. So unfortunately, B, I can safely say, will still go home. Episode 4. So if Finders Keepers, Aljandro is a bit concerned because he knows that Scott is very good and Scott's manipulating Lightning and Sam. Obviously, Aljandro's going to try and get Dawn on his side to make a tie. She's just by herself, so... And Aljandro knows that she's smart, but I think he would look past her to get rid of Scott here. So Aljandro, in the scavenger hunt, Joe would just climb the tree herself and Lightning was to get caught like he does normally. Zoe gets captured, Mike's panicking, trying to look for her. Brooke would go back to save Zoe, but he gets caught. And Maria, then Mike turns into Vito, and he would still be making out with Maria from the entire episode. Sierra would then get captured. No, Cody, Sierra wouldn't go rage mode. Dawn gets captured here. I imagine Dakota will get caught. She's not an intern, but I think she would definitely get caught here. Aljandro was pretty good in the All-Stars challenge with Ezekiel. And I don't think it'd take much for Aljandro to get caught. And Joe gets caught by herself. Mike would then turn to Svetlana and save Brick. And in the original, Joe asked Brick to win the challenge and leave. But because Scott and Sam are together, I don't imagine Brick would just leave at this point. And Brick wouldn't just... At this point, Brick, obviously... Joe wouldn't say this because Brick is by himself. So I think Brick would still go out, and Scott and Sam would end up winning for his team. This would annoy Scott because obviously he wants to get rid of Aljandro, but there's not a lot he can do. So the maggots are safe. Brick survives another day. The rats win, and because this is an actual elimination round, basically... So the rats win. Basically, Brick volunteers himself as tribute, as he originally did that as he broke his code of honor. So I think Brick would still do this as a result. So Brick would still get eliminated, which will really be sad for Sierra because I imagine Sierra and Brick would have been friends at this point. Episode 5. Backstabbers Ahoy. So, this is the episode where they have to shoot water sea gun water at... This is it. So, starting off with the diving equipment, Aljandro would dive and Lightning would pump. Scott would still say how his tooth of fang was stolen, and Maria's hairbrush and Joe's whistle, and Sam's game guy as well as Lightning's protein powder. Dakota would obviously be with Aljandro at this point, so I imagine Sam would be torn at this point, and Scott's going to realize that Aljandro's a problem because Sam is he needs Sam on his side, and Sam likes Dakota, so Aljandro could convince Sam to maybe get with Dakota and get his vote. So at this point, Scott would probably reluctantly work with Aljandro, because keep in mind that this is a situation where Scott knows Aljandro's a very good player, Aljandro's very smart. So here... Joe would go in the suit and Sierra pumps. I think Aljandro and Lightning pumps too much air. Joe wins. So the driver would be Zoe. Shooter Joe. The driver Lightning. Shooter Scott. Now Scott's shot would still be way off, as he would still be throwing challenges. And Svetlana would end up getting a point. And Maria. Sierra would end up getting a point as well. Aljandro would get a point. And would get Sam to try and get with Dakota. He would also try to convince Dawn in this episode to try and make him an alliance, saying, look, I know we're not the best of friends here, but if I get voted off, the other 4 are going to vote you next. Do you really want that chance? I have Dakota. Let's say I go, then Scott can just get Dakota or Dawn in the next episode. Do you really want me out here? I think Dawn will think about it on whether or not she'll work with Aljandro. And here... I think here we have Lightning would end up, so at the end of this, the maggots win. Now, Scott would want to frame someone for the items. I think he would want to frame Aljandro, but I think he would rather frame Dawn here, as she's a lot smarter. So I think Scott would frame Dawn, But the only person voting with Dawn being Alejandro. But I think Dakota would flip and actually vote for Dawn. So I do think Dawn would still go home. Episode 6 is Runaway Model, so this episode where Lindsay gets captured. So Dakota would still be good at the fashion tips. She could just tell Sam. Joe would still attract the Yeti, with Chester obviously doing his part, and Sierra. Then after that, it would be the running up to the Yeti. So Lightning would get hit down. Scott, Dakota, and Sam. Alejandro would jump across the barrels. And Zoe and Anne-Marie and Sierra might do alright. Between Joe and Alejandro, it's a bit hard to say. But Joe managed to get to the top originally, and I imagine Scott would be throwing challenges and would prevent Alejandro from getting to the top. So I do think Joe would more than likely win the challenge. So Scott would convince Lightning and Sam to get rid of Alejandro, and Dakota and Alejandro would get rid of Scott. I think between Alejandro and Scott, it's a bit hard to say, but I think Sam would vote for Alejandro, just because of the fact that Scott's been a lot nicer to him throughout the season. And although Alejandro did help him with his relationship advice, I think ultimately Alejandro's a big threat. Get him out while we can. And Alejandro says, you've been played. Watch out for the traitor in the group. But this vote's actually important because Joe and Scott would swap teams. But other than that, it's a non-elimination. Episode 7. So search for the golden minecart as a result. So Scott would realize that he needs to throw challenges, and Scott would find the other. Now, Anne-Maria and Sierra, I think Alejandro would see Mike and Zoe's relationship are pretty threatening. Anne-Maria likes Vita. I think Scott would get Sierra and Anne-Maria to try and to manipulate them. And at this point, Scott obviously, Lightning would still cause a cave in on the rats. Joe and Lightning would make an alliance to get rid of the power couple, as Dakota and Sam would probably start dating at this point. Sierra, she would use her rage pop. She would be alright here. Maria still gets captured by Ezekiel, and I think Lightning would have the statue. But what normally happens here is Brick turns around and saves the maggots. But that wouldn't happen in this timeline, because Joe and Lightning would just have the statue before Scott, so they would actually win the challenge. So it's kind of funny, by Scott not throwing the challenge, they end up losing the challenge. So Scott has Sierra and Anne-Maria. But Anne-Maria likes Mike, so she asks, can they vote for Zoe? So these three vote for Zoe. Mike and Zoe, they vote for Anne-Marie, vote for Scott. So I think Anne-Maria they vote for Zoe tonight. However, luckily for them, Anne-Maria just quits. Actually, so Scott, who would he get rid of here? So Scott gets Anne-Marie to vote Sierra. Mike and Zoe vote for Scott. And Anne-Maria and Sierra votes for Zoe. So it's a tie between Scott and Sierra, and I think Sierra. So these three vote for Zoe. Yeah, that's fine. And then Anne-Maria would just quit. I think it's fair enough. Episode 8, Treasure Island of Dr. McLean. So this is the episode where Scott obviously... Okay, so episode 7. So they lose. So Scott would convince Mike that he will vote with them tonight if he helps them get rid of Sierra. So Mike and Zoe vote for Scott. Scott, Anne-Marie, and Sierra vote for Zoe. So Zoe and then Anne-Maria would quit. So yeah, that's fine. Episode 8 is the Treasure Island of Dr. McLean. Scott would apologize to Mike and how he voted Zoe last episode, but you gotta understand you're a couple. He tells Mike they should work together to get rid of Sierra, and Mike says why would he work with him, because, why would he just vote with Sierra? But Scott points out that Sierra is a very massive threat, and she makes it to the merge. Obviously, she's going to be a very massive challenge threat. So the first part of the challenge is what Mike thinks about it. Because that camera's not there, Scott never finds out Mike's multiple personality, so he cannot blackmail him in episode 9. So episode 8 is the Treasure Island of Dr. McLean. Sam wouldn't get buried underground, first of all, as he's in the game. And because of the season's so different, Dakota wouldn't be mutated, so she wouldn't be Dakota side here. Joe and Lightning would end up still getting attacked by the squid, so the maggots would win. Scott would still steal the compass and map and would end up throwing the challenge for the other team. And because the maggots would have to actually go around the bush because Dakota is not on their team, and they would take a lot longer, I think the rats would win this challenge. So it's kind of funny by Scott still throwing and no Dakotazoid. Scott, the maggots will lose the challenge. So Mike and Sierra would vote for Scott. But Scott still has the immunity out at this point, so it's now whoever Scott decides to eliminate. And I think out of these group of people, Scott would choose to get rid of Sierra, as Sierra is the biggest threat of the two. And Scott doesn't know about Mike's personalities here, so he really has no reason to get rid of Mike. As he realizes facing the Lightning as well in the finale and Sierra would not be a good idea. Now we're at the merge. The merge is quite different, so bye-bye rats, bye-bye maggots. The only difference here is we do not have Zoe and Cameron instead of Dakota and Sam. So episode 9, episode 9, Sam's brain's probably got to mush at this point. So episode 9 is Grand Theft Auto. So because Joe and Lightning would still be in a short-term alliance, Joe realized that Dakota and Sam, obviously, those two are a couple. Scott is Scott, and I don't think Joe would betray Lightning here. Joe would still betray Lightning, and Scott wouldn't blackmail Mike in this episode, so he wouldn't be able to be towed. However, in my opinion, I think Mike would have probably won the challenge if Scott didn't blackmail Mike here. So I think Mike would actually win immunity. And because Mike has sole vote, he decides to get rid of Scott, as Scott is the biggest threat in the game. Get him out while we can. Episode 10 is where they have to... So Joe gets the hot air balloon and Lightning gets the rocket. Now Mike, Sam, and Dakota was not originally here. So Dakota gets the plane. Mike gets the bird, and Sam gets the rocket. And Joe would have to make the hot air balloon herself first, because obviously Scott would... There's no camera to make her thing. So Mike wouldn't decide how this would go. Because Mike wouldn't sabotage anyone, Lightning ends up winning immunity, as Lightning was the closest besides Cameron, and Cameron's not here now, so Lightning will be able to win very easily by getting the case off. First, the result. The only person I could possibly see person with immunity is Joe, but I think someone like Mike could definitely sabotage Joe here, and Sam and Dakota is not doing that well in this challenge. So, Lightning and Joe probably, would they still work together? Probably not at this point if he still betrayed her. So Mike would vote for Joe. Dakota and Sam, they vote for each other. But Mike being Mike realizes Dakota and Sam are a couple. So I'm going to say in episode 9, Joe doesn't betray Lightning yet in this timeline. So Mike convinces Joe and Lightning to help him and get rid of the power couple. And I think Joe would convince Lightning and Mike to get rid of Dakota and Sam. One of them, as they clearly realize they're a massive threat. And I think between Dakota and Sam, between the two, I think Dakota and Sam vote for Joe, as Lightning has immunity. Lightning votes for Joe, and Mike would vote for Joe, so I think Joe would still eliminate it like normal. Episode 11, Eat Puke Me Racist. So Mike would try to convince Lightning into working in an alliance with him to get rid of the power couple, but Lightning says he's a one-man team, and I don't think Lightning would necessarily want to work with Mike at this point. But I think Lightning realizes it's probably not best to face a couple. So he reluctantly agrees to work with Mike here. So the Eat Puke Me Worry, Dakota and Sam will be that good here. Mike's personality is going to be that good. I think Lightning will actually win the first part of the challenge. So it's a race to the end between Mike and Lightning. So Dakota and Sam definitely aren't making it to the end. However, because Lightning and Mike still had their alliance, I think Lightning actually would be able to get to the end faster than... I think Mike would have Svetlana. I'm going to base this on the obstacle course in All-Stars, because it's pretty odd to say it's close, but I think I'm going to give the immunity to Lightning. As Mike would obviously not want to risk his alliance, but he wouldn't travel on the Lightning's back unlike Cameron. So Lightning and Mike vote for Dakota, and Dakota and Sam vote for Mike. So it's a tiebreaker between Dakota and Mike, and I think Mike is winning this tie. Episode 12 is where they have to get the fire plant. So Mike decides to work with Sam, as obviously he's the only character left who... Lightning's the biggest threat, so Mike and Sam have to run maps. And they have to get the fire plant. So what happens here is who would get the plant first. Lightning or Mike. And I think Lightning would actually get the plant before any one of these two. As actually, no, I think Mike would win immunity, so he'd get the plant faster. And between Sam and Lightning, he's obviously taken Sam to the end, as Lightning would be not a good opponent to face. So Lightning is third place. Third place, Lightning. There's Mike and Sam. I don't know how Sam became a finalist, but that's a canon version. So they have to paint each other for 3 seconds. Obviously, there's no way Sam's going to be Mike unless he goes gamer mode. Aljandro's pretty impressed that he made it to the finale. Scott's kind of bummed out that he didn't get as far, but at least he made it pretty far. They each get winning endings depending on how long it takes to paint each other down. So if you guys are watching, this the animation I think season 1 have gone. In part 2, if Aljandro and Sierra were involved, it was in Revenge of the Island. And yeah, peace for all.